In the hierarchy of the German war machine, there was one group of soldiers who saw themselves as a class apart. They were not soldiers of the land, nor pilots of the sky. They were the silent hunters of the abyss. The men of the German U-boat force. The U-Boot-Waffe. This was an elite brotherhood, forged in the cramped, claustrophobic confines of a steel tube, deep beneath the waves of the hostile Atlantic. They were all volunteers, drawn to the service by a promise of adventure, professional pride, and the allure of a swift and glorious victory against the British Empire. The U-boat service was a young man's game, and it was led by a man who understood its brutal calculus better than anyone. Admiral Karl Dönitz. Dönitz was not just a commander, he was a true believer. He was the architect and the high priest of Germany's submarine strategy. He believed that Britain, an island nation utterly dependent on imports for its survival, could be brought to its knees by a single, focused strategy. The tonnage war. The concept was simple and brutal. Every ship sunk was a blow to Britain's ability to fight. Sink enough ships, faster than the Allies could build them, and Britain would starve. Its factories would fall silent. Its war effort would collapse. And the weapon for this war was the U-boat. The workhorse of Dönitz's fleet was the Type 7, a masterpiece of deadly, efficient design. It was not a true submarine in the modern sense. It was a submersible torpedo boat. Faster on the surface than it was underwater, it spent most of its time on the surface, only diving to attack or to escape. But in the hands of a skilled crew, it was the most effective commerce raider the world had ever seen. And the men who commanded these boats were a special breed. They were the U-boat aces. Commanders like Gunther Prien, who had audaciously slipped his U-47 into the heavily defended British naval base at Scapa Flow and sunk the battleship HMS Royal Oak. Men like Joachim Schepke, a charismatic and aggressive commander. And the greatest of them all, Otto Kretschmer, the Wolf of the Atlantic, a quiet, methodical genius of torpedo warfare who would become the highest-scoring submarine ace in history. These men were the rock stars of the Third Reich. Their faces adorned the covers of magazines. Their exploits were celebrated on the radio. Each time a commander returned to port, his boat flying flags to signify his kills, he was greeted as a national hero. This adulation, combined with their incredible success, forged a culture of supreme confidence and professional arrogance. The U-boat crews saw themselves as the best of the best. They looked with contempt upon the slow, lumbering merchant ships they hunted. And they held an even greater contempt for the pathetic, amateurish anti-submarine efforts of the early British Royal Navy. They were the grey wolves of the Atlantic, the masters of the deep. In the early years of the war, they believed, with good reason, that they were invincible. They believed they held the key to Germany's ultimate victory. And as they sailed from their concrete pens on the coast of France, they were confident that they were about to deliver the killing blow to a reeling and defenseless Great Britain. The period from the summer of 1940 to the spring of 1941 would forever be known in the annals of the German U-boat service by a single, chilling name. Die glückliche Zeit. The happy time. With the fall of France, the U-boats were no longer bottled up in the North Sea. They now had direct access to the vast expanse of the Atlantic from new bases on the French coast, at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. The British were on their knees. Their navy was stretched to the breaking point, defending against a threatened invasion and fighting in the Mediterranean. The convoy system, which had been so effective in the First World War, was in its infancy. The escorts were few. They were slow. And they were pathetically under-equipped. Into this target-rich environment, Admiral Dönitz unleashed his U-boats. And the results were a staggering, one-sided slaughter. The key to this success was a revolutionary and deadly tactic that Dönitz himself had perfected. The Wolf Pack. Das Rudeltaktik. A single U-boat, operating alone, might have trouble finding and sinking ships in the vastness of the ocean. But a coordinated pack of submarines could be devastating. The method was simple and brilliant. A U-boat on patrol, upon sighting an Allied convoy, would not attack immediately. Instead, it would surface, often out of sight of the convoy, and begin to shadow it. It would then transmit a contact report back to U-boat command in France, broadcasting the convoy's position, course, and speed. Admiral Dönitz and his staff, from their headquarters, would then vector in every available U-boat in the vicinity. Over the next day or two, the pack would gather, like wolves circling a herd of sheep. Then, when the pack was assembled, the order would be given. The attack would almost always come at night. The U-boats, using their superior surface speed, would race ahead of the convoy in the darkness. Then they would turn and attack on the surface, from inside the convoy's own columns. To the handful of British escorts, it was a nightmare. Their early Aztec equipment, an underwater sonar device, was designed to detect submerged submarines. It was completely useless against a U-boat attacking on the surface. In the darkness, the low profile of the U-boat's conning tower was almost impossible to spot. Suddenly, a torpedo would slam into the side of a merchant ship. A massive explosion would light up the night sky. Then, another. And another. The escorts would race towards the site of the attack, firing star shells, desperately searching for an enemy they could not see. But the U-boats were already gone, having slipped away into the darkness to reload their torpedo tubes and prepare for the next attack. For the crews of the Allied merchant ships, it was a reign of terror. They were civilian sailors, armed with little more than their own courage, and they were being hunted by the most efficient predators in the world. A torpedo strike on a tanker carrying aviation fuel was an instant death sentence, an inferno from which there was no escape. A hit on a munitions ship would cause the vessel to simply vaporize in a cataclysmic blast. Even a successful sinking in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic often meant a slow, agonizing death from hypothermia for the men in the lifeboats. During this first happy time, the German U-boat aces achieved a level of success that was almost unbelievable. Gunther Prien, in a single patrol, sank over 58,000 tons of shipping. Otto Kretschmer, the tonnage king, sank 3 British armed merchant cruisers in a matter of minutes. The numbers were horrifying. Almost 1,500 Allied ships were sunk in this period. Millions of tons of vital food, fuel, and war materials were sent to the bottom of the ocean. Britain was being bled white. The U-boat commanders returned to their bases as conquering heroes. Their confidence was absolute. They had perfected a tactic that the British had no answer for. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that they were winning the war. And they were right. In early 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic was not just a battle Germany was winning. It was a battle Britain was on the verge of losing. The reign of the Grey Wolves was at its zenith. While the U-boat crews celebrated their victories, a different, more desperate battle was being fought by the men of the British Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy. For Great Britain, an island nation that imported more than half of its food and nearly all of its raw materials, the Battle of the Atlantic was not just a military campaign. It was a battle for national survival. Every burning tanker, every foundering cargo ship, was another step towards starvation and defeat. Winston Churchill, in his memoirs, would later write, "The Battle of the Atlantic was the dominating factor all through the war. Never for one moment could we forget that everything happening elsewhere, on land, at sea, or in the air, depended ultimately on its outcome. The only hope for Britain, the only lifeline, was the convoy system. The concept was a simple one, learned at great cost in the First World War. A lone merchant ship was easy prey, but a group of ships, sailing together in a formation, protected by a screen of warships, had a fighting chance. The heart of this system was the North Atlantic convoy route, a brutal 3,000-mile gauntlet that stretched from the ports of Halifax in Canada and New York in America, to the beleaguered docks of Liverpool and Glasgow. Along this route sailed the ships that carried the lifeblood of Britain: grain from the Canadian prairies, oil from the fields of Texas, steel, aluminum, and munitions from the factories of the American arsenal. And the men who crewed these ships were not professional soldiers. They were civilian merchant seamen, old men, young boys, and sailors from every corner of the Allied world. Their ships were often old, slow, and completely unarmed. They were the sheep, and they knew the wolves were circling. Their only protection came from the escort groups of the Royal Navy. But in the early years of the war, this protection was tragically inadequate. The workhorses of the escort fleet were the Flower-class corvettes. These were small, simple warships, built quickly and in large numbers. They were named after flowers, ships like the HMS Gladiolus and the HMS Crocus, a gentle name for a vessel doing one of the dirtiest jobs of the war. The corvettes were tough, seaworthy boats. But they were slow, often slower than a surfaced U-boat. And they were desperately under-equipped. Their primary anti-submarine weapon was the depth charge, a barrel of high explosives that was rolled or thrown off the back of the ship. To have any chance of success, the escort had to pass directly over the position of a submerged U-boat. It was a crude and often ineffective weapon. The most critical piece of equipment the escorts possessed was ASTIC, an early form of sonar that sent a ping of sound through the water. If the sound wave hit a submerged object, it would bounce back as an echo, revealing the U-boat's bearing and range. ASTIC was a revolutionary technology, but it had critical limitations. It was useless against a surfaced U-boat. It could be fooled by thermal layers in the water, or by the wake of other ships. And it was blind in the final moments of an attack, as the depth charges were being dropped. The men of the escort groups were fighting a three-dimensional war of science and nerve, in some of the worst weather conditions on the planet. They faced monstrous gales, mountainous waves, and pack ice. And they did it all under the constant, nerve-shredding threat of a torpedo that could appear from nowhere at any moment. The commander of one of these escort groups, a man who would become a legend of the Atlantic, Captain Frederick Johnny Walker, described the challenge. The U-boat is a wild and savage beast. It is a thing of the night. To hunt it, you must be more patient, more cunning, and more ruthless than your opponent. You must work in a team. You must anticipate his every move. And you must never, ever give up. But in one fateful night in the Atlantic, the odds were stacked impossibly against them. There were not enough escorts. There were not enough weapons. And there was one vast, terrifying area of the ocean where the escorts and their fragile flock were completely and utterly alone. The convoy route across the North Atlantic was a journey into a succession of dangers. For the first few hundred miles out from the shores of North America, the convoys had a degree of protection. They were covered by land-based aircraft flying from bases in Newfoundland and Iceland. These planes, like the Catalina flying boat, could spot surfaced U-boats and force them to submerge, or even attack them with depth charges. For the last few hundred miles of the journey, as the convoys approached the British Isles, they came under the protective umbrella of the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command. Aircraft flying from bases in Scotland and Northern Ireland provided a crucial air escort for the final, dangerous leg of the trip. But in the center of the vast, unforgiving ocean, there was a hole. A massive 1,000-mile-wide stretch of the Atlantic that was beyond the maximum range of any land-based Allied aircraft available in the early years of the war. The sailors who plied the route had a simple, terrifying name for it: the Black Pit. This was the Mid-Atlantic Gap. For the U-boat commanders, this gap was a paradise. It was their private hunting ground, a sanctuary. The moment a convoy entered the Black Pit, it was on its own. The air cover vanished. The merchant ships and their handful of surface escorts were now completely isolated, a tiny island of humanity in a hostile wilderness of water. And it was here, in the cold, gray expanse of the mid-Atlantic, that the wolf packs gathered. Admiral Dönitz knew about the gap. His entire strategy was built around it. He would position his U-boats in long patrol lines, waiting for the convoys to sail into this zone of maximum vulnerability. Once a U-boat made contact, it could surface with impunity, even in broad daylight. There were no airplanes to force it down. The U-boat could shadow the convoy, radio its position, and assemble the pack, all without fear of attack from the air. For the escort commanders, entering the Black Pit was a moment of profound dread. They would scan the horizon, knowing that the enemy was out there, watching them, gathering its strength. The tension would become almost unbearable. And then, the attacks would begin. Night after night, the U-boats would strike. The darkness of the mid-Atlantic was absolute, a perfect cloak for the surface attacks of the wolf pack. The escort ships would race back and forth, firing star shells that would briefly illuminate a hellish scene of burning ships and desperate men clinging to wreckage. But they were chasing ghosts. They would get a faint astic contact, rush to the spot, and drop a pattern of depth charges into the empty ocean, while another torpedo, fired from a different U-boat miles away, would strike another ship in the convoy. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single, continuous engagement. It was a series of brutal, bloody convoy battles, and the vast majority of them were fought and decided here, in the unprotected wilderness of the mid-Atlantic gap. This geographical reality was the single greatest advantage the Germans possessed. It was a problem that could not be solved by courage or tactics alone. The British Admiralty knew this. They pleaded with the Americans for more long-range aircraft. They experimented with catapult-launched fighters from the decks of merchant ships, a desperate, one-way solution. But for the first 3.5 years of the war, the Black Pit remained. It was a strategic blind spot, a gaping wound in the Allied defenses. And as long as it existed, the U-boats would continue to feast. As long as the Black Pit existed, the Battle of the Atlantic, and the very survival of Great Britain, would hang by the most fragile of threads. The Allies were fighting a war of attrition. But they were fighting it on a battlefield where, for 1,000 miles, the enemy was the undisputed master. The battle against the U-boats was not just being fought with depth charges and cannons in the icy waters of the Atlantic. It was also being fought in silence. In a quiet country estate in the heart of England, a different kind of war was being waged. A war of intellect, of mathematics, and of secrets. This was Bletchley Park. Station X. The top-secret home of Britain's government code and cipher school. Here, a strange and brilliant collection of people, professors, mathematicians, linguists, and even crossword puzzle champions, had been assembled for a single monumental task: to break the secret codes of the German war machine. And the most important, and most difficult, of all these codes was the one used by the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine. The Enigma code. The Enigma machine was a marvel of electromechanical engineering. It looked like a typewriter, but it was, in fact, one of the most complex encryption devices ever created. An operator would type a plain text message, and through a series of rotating scrambler wheels and a complex plugboard, the machine would output a seemingly random jumble of letters. The number of possible settings on the naval Enigma machine was astronomical. Over 150 million. To the German High Command, and to Admiral Dönitz, the Enigma code was absolutely, positively unbreakable. This belief in Enigma's security was the cornerstone of the entire Wolf Pack strategy. It allowed Dönitz to communicate with his U-boats at sea, to gather them for an attack, and to direct the battle from his headquarters, all with what he believed was total secrecy. He was tragically wrong. Thanks to the early pioneering work of Polish mathematicians, and a series of daring captures of Enigma machines and codebooks from captured German ships and U-boats, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park had achieved the impossible. They had found a way in. Led by the brilliant, eccentric genius of Alan Turing, the team at Bletchley Park developed a series of electromechanical machines called bombs. These massive, complex machines, clicking and clattering away day and night, were designed to rapidly test thousands of possible Enigma settings. When they found the right one, they could decrypt the German naval messages. The result was a source of intelligence so pure, so secret, and so vital that it was given its own codename: Ultra. From the spring of 1941, the British Admiralty was, for long periods, able to read Dönitz's most secret communications. They could see the map on his wall. They knew where he was positioning his U-boat patrol lines. They knew which convoys he was planning to attack. They knew the rendezvous points for the wolf packs. This was a weapon of almost godlike power. And it gave the beleaguered convoy escorts their first real advantage. An Admiralty tracking room, known as the U-boat pit, became the nerve center of the battle. Here, the ultra-intelligence was combined with reports from reconnaissance aircraft and direction-finding stations. For the first time, the Allies could see the invisible enemy. The effect was immediate. When Bletchley Park decrypted a message revealing a U-boat patrol line, a signal would be flashed to the convoy's commodore. Turn 40 degrees to starboard. Immediately, the entire convoy, dozens of ships, would alter course, sailing into what seemed like an empty part of the ocean. The U-boat crews, waiting patiently on their patrol line, would see nothing. The convoy had simply vanished. The U-boat aces, who had grown accustomed to easy slaughter, were now finding the seas to be strangely, unnervingly empty. Their contact reports plummeted. The tonnage they were sinking dropped dramatically. They were baffled. They blamed bad luck, bad weather, and faulty intelligence. It never occurred to them, not for a moment, that the enemy was reading their mail. The war of whispers, waged in the quiet huts of Bletchley Park, was saving thousands of lives and millions of tons of shipping. It was Britain's secret shield. It was the invisible weapon that, for a crucial period, kept the fragile lifeline open. But the codebreakers' advantage was precarious. It was a constant, desperate intellectual battle against the German cipher experts. And in early 1942, the Germans were about to make a change that would plunge the codebreakers back into darkness, and give the Grey Wolves a bloody and terrible second chance. The Allied advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic was built on a single, fragile secret: the ability to read the German naval Enigma code. But Admiral Dönitz was not a fool. While he never suspected that Enigma itself had been broken, he was a careful and security-conscious commander. He was troubled by the U-boat's sudden lack of success in 1941. And he suspected that the British had developed a highly effective intelligence or direction-finding system. His solution was to make the U-boat's communications even more secure. On February 1, 1942, the German Navy introduced a new, and vastly more complex, version of the Enigma machine, exclusively for its U-boat fleet. This new machine, which the British codenamed Shark, featured a fourth rotor, a super-enciphering wheel that was added to the standard three-rotor Enigma. The effect of this one single change was catastrophic. It did not just make the code harder to break. It increased the number of possible settings by a factor of 26. The cryptographic complexity exploded. And for the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, the lights went out. The bombs, the machines that Alan Turing had designed, were built to solve a three-rotor problem. They were completely useless against the new four-rotor Shark cipher. The stream of ultra-intelligence, the secret shield that had been protecting the convoys, dried up overnight. The Admiralty's U-boat tracking room went blind. Dönitz and his U-boats had vanished, disappearing back into the impenetrable fog of electronic secrecy. This cryptographic disaster could not have come at a worse time for the Allies. Because just a few weeks earlier, in December of 1941, the United States had entered the war. And the American eastern seaboard was a U-boat commander's dream. It was a target-rich environment, and it was completely, almost criminally, unprepared for war. Cities along the coast refused to implement blackouts, their lights silhouetting the merchant ships sailing offshore, turning them into perfect targets. The U.S. Navy, lacking experience in anti-submarine warfare, was slow to implement a convoy system along its own coast. Into this unprepared arena, Dönitz launched Operation Drumbeat. He sent his best, most experienced U-boat aces across the Atlantic to the American coast. And what followed was a massacre. The German commanders called it the second happy time. Day after day, night after night, tankers and cargo ships were torpedoed and sunk within sight of the beaches of North Carolina and Florida. Vacationers on the shore could watch the pillars of smoke rising from the burning ships. The U-boats operated with a brazen impunity, sinking ships at will. The losses were staggering. In the first 6 months of 1942, the U-boats sank over 600 ships in the Western Atlantic and the Caribbean. The tonnage lost was greater than at any other point in the war. The Grey Wolves were back. And they were more deadly than ever. Bletchley Park was in a state of frantic, desperate crisis. Every mind was focused on a single, seemingly impossible task: breaking back into the Shark cipher. But the complexity of the four-rotor system was immense. Month after agonizing month, they failed. The Battle of the Atlantic was once again being lost. The losses were becoming unsustainable. The bridge of ships, the vital lifeline that supplied Great Britain and was now essential for the buildup of American forces for the eventual invasion of Europe, was on the verge of collapsing. The U-boat aces, their confidence restored and their arrogance greater than ever, believed they were now on the cusp of total victory. Dönitz, emboldened by his success, moved his wolf packs back into the North Atlantic, to sever the main convoy route once and for all. And with Bletchley Park still blind, the convoys were sailing directly into their ambushes. The winter of 1942 and the spring of 1943 marked the absolute climax of the Battle of the Atlantic. The losses were horrific. The Allied war effort was in peril. The German High Command believed the U-boat, their wonder weapon, was finally going to win the war. But even as the codebreakers struggled in the dark, a different group of Allied scientists and engineers were about to unleash a series of new, and equally secret, weapons. These were not weapons of cryptography. They were weapons of physics. And they were about to turn the U-boat's greatest advantage, its stealth, into a fatal liability. While the codebreakers of Bletchley Park were fighting their desperate, silent war against the Enigma machine, a parallel revolution was taking place in the world of radio technology. The German wolf pack tactic, for all its deadly effectiveness, had a single, inherent weakness. To assemble a pack, the U-boats had to communicate. The U-boat that first spotted a convoy had to transmit a contact report. And the other U-boats in the area had to transmit short signals back to headquarters to acknowledge their orders. These were short, high-frequency radio transmissions, enciphered in the unbreakable shark code. To Admiral Dönitz, these transmissions were safe. He believed that as long as the content of the message was secret, the transmission itself posed no danger. He was wrong. Because the Allies were perfecting a technology that did not care what the message said. It only cared about where the message came from. It was called high-frequency direction finding. Or, more famously, Huff-Duff. The principle was simple. A radio signal travels in a straight line. If you have two or more separate radio receivers, at different locations, and they both pick up the same signal, you can draw a line from each receiver in the direction the signal came from. The point where those lines intersect is the location of the transmitter. Early, shore-based direction-finding stations were not fast enough to be effective against the U-boat's short, burst transmissions. But British and American scientists had been working on a new, and revolutionary, shipboard version of the technology. This new Huff-Duff set was equipped with a circular antenna array and a cathode ray tube display, similar to a modern oscilloscope. When a U-boat made a transmission, even one lasting only a few seconds, the operator on the escort ship would see an instant visual spike on his screen. The position of that spike on the circular screen would give him an immediate, and highly accurate, bearing to the transmitting U-boat. This was a game-changer. Beginning in late 1942, the new Huff-Duff sets were secretly installed on the escort ships of the Royal Navy. For the first time, the escort commanders had ears. They were no longer just blindly reacting to torpedo strikes. They could now hear the wolves whispering to each other in the dark. Imagine the scene in the operations room of an escort commander's destroyer. The convoy is in the middle of the black pit. The night is dark. Suddenly, the Huff-Duff operator calls out, "Signal bearing 090, 10 miles." The commander now knows something he has never known before. He knows the enemy is there. And he knows exactly where there is. He can now turn his ship and lead his hunter-killer group directly towards the unsuspecting U-boat. The effect was immediate and profound. The U-boat commander, sitting on the surface, confidently transmitting his contact report, would suddenly see the dark, menacing shape of a destroyer charging out of the night, straight at him. He would be forced to crash dive, to abandon his shadowing, and to fight for his own survival. The wolf pack was being broken up before it could even form. Huff-Duff was a weapon that turned the U-boat's greatest strength, their coordination, into a fatal weakness. The more they talked, the more precisely the Allies could locate them. The U-boat commanders were baffled. They would surface, see nothing on the horizon, transmit a quick signal, and within minutes, an enemy escort would be bearing down on them. They had no idea how they were being found. Some suspected a new, and almost magical, form of Allied detection. The reality was that their own radio signals were acting as a homing beacon, leading the hunters directly to their doorstep. Huff-Duff was the first of the new generation of scientific weapons that would doom the U-boat. It gave the escorts the ability to detect. But another new technology was about to give them the ability to see. To see in the dark. To see through the fog. And to strip away the U-boat's final, and most precious, defense. The cloak of invisibility. The U-boat was a creature of the surface. Its diesel engines required air, and its batteries had a very limited underwater endurance. It lived, hunted, and traveled on the surface, especially at night. Its only defense, in the vast, empty ocean, was stealth. The low profile of its conning tower, just a few feet above the waves, made it incredibly difficult to spot with the naked eye, especially in the dark, or in the rough seas of the North Atlantic. This was the U-boat's cloak of invisibility. And in early 1943, the Allies were about to tear it to shreds. The technology that would achieve this was radar. Early radar sets, operating on longer wavelengths, had been deployed by both sides. But they were bulky, and they lacked the resolution to detect an object as small as a U-boat's conning tower amidst the clutter of the waves. The breakthrough came from a single, revolutionary invention. The cavity magnetron. Developed by British scientists, this small, simple device was a powerful and efficient generator of high-frequency microwaves. It was the key that unlocked the world of centimetric radar. This new, short-wavelength radar was a quantum leap in technology. Its beams were narrower, more focused. Its resolution was incredibly high, and the sets were small enough to be fitted not just onto large warships, but onto every single escort corvette, and even onto patrol aircraft. Beginning in early 1943, the new Type 271 centimetric radar began to appear on the ships of the escort groups. The effect was magical. For the first time, the men on the bridge of a destroyer had eyes that could see in the dark. Imagine a lookout, straining his eyes against the blackness of a stormy Atlantic night. He sees nothing but waves. But below him, in the darkened radar room, an operator is watching a glowing green screen. A tiny persistent blip of light appears at the edge of the screen. Radar contact. Green 40. Range, 5,000 yards. The U-boat commander, sitting on his conning tower, feels completely safe. He is miles away from the convoy, shrouded in darkness and rain. He is invisible. He has no idea that his conning tower is reflecting a stream of microwave energy back to an antenna on a British destroyer. He has no idea that his exact range and bearing are now known. Suddenly, a star shell bursts overhead, illuminating his U-boat in a brilliant, terrifying glare. Moments later, the first shells from the destroyer's main guns begin to fall around him. Panic. A crash dive. But it is too late. The hunter has already seen him. The psychological impact on the U-boat crews was even more devastating than that of Huff-Duff. They were being hunted by an enemy with supernatural senses. They could no longer trust the darkness. They could no longer trust the bad weather. There was no longer any place to hide on the surface of the ocean. To counter this new threat, the Germans developed a radar warning receiver, the Metox. It was a crude device, a simple wooden cross with wires, that could detect the Allies' older, long-wave radar signals. When the Metox buzzed, the U-boat commander knew he had been spotted and could dive. But the new centimetric radar operated on a frequency the Metox could not detect. The first warning a U-boat commander would get that he had been spotted by the new radar was the sound of shells exploding around his boat. The scientists of the Allied Boffin War had outmaneuvered their enemy. But the true genius of the new radar was not just its deployment on ships. It was its miniaturization. It was small enough and light enough to be fitted into the belly of a long-range patrol bomber. This was the final, crucial piece of the technological puzzle. It was the weapon that was about to turn the U-boat's safest hunting ground into their most dangerous graveyard. It was the weapon that would finally close the mid-Atlantic gap. For 3.5 years, the mid-Atlantic gap, the Black Pit, had been the U-boat's untouchable sanctuary. It was the keystone of Admiral Dönitz's entire strategy. The inability of Allied aircraft to patrol this vast, central part of the ocean was the single greatest factor in the U-boat's success. But by early 1943, this critical Allied weakness was about to be eliminated. The solution came in the form of one of the workhorses of the American bomber fleet, the consolidated B-24 Liberator. The Liberator was a remarkable aircraft. With its long, slender, high aspect ratio Davis wing, it was designed for one thing above all else: range. While it was not as beloved by its crews as the rugged B-17, it could fly farther and carry a heavier bomb load than any other aircraft of its time. A handful of these Liberators were taken from the strategic bombing campaign and specially modified for a new, and even more critical, mission: anti-submarine warfare. They were stripped of all non-essential equipment, armor plating, even some of their machine guns, to save weight. Extra fuel tanks were crammed into the bomb bay. They were painted a stark, sea-camouflaged white to make them harder to spot from below against the bright sky. These were the VLRs, the Very Long-Range Liberators. And they were a technological marvel, packed with a suite of deadly new submarine hunting tools. In their belly, they carried the new, lightweight ASV Mark III centimetric radar. This gave them the ability to detect a surfaced U-boat from miles away, at night, or in a storm. Slung under their wings were a new type of weapon. Not bombs, but acoustic homing torpedoes, which could actively seek out the sound of a submerged U-boat's propellers. And most fearsome of all, they were equipped with a new, powerful searchlight, codenamed the Lee Light. This was a massive, 22 million candela carbon arc searchlight, synchronized with the radar. The effect of these integrated systems was devastatingly simple. A VLR Liberator, patrolling the blackness of the mid-Atlantic, would get a radar contact. The pilot would descend, using his radar to guide him invisibly towards the unsuspecting U-boat. Then, when he was just a mile away, and a few hundred feet above the surface, he would switch on the Lee Light. For the U-boat crew on the conning tower, the world would suddenly, and without warning, be turned from absolute blackness into brilliant, blinding daylight. They would be frozen in the glare, like a deer in the headlights of an oncoming truck. And a moment later, the Liberator would be on top of them, its machine guns blazing, its depth charges or homing torpedoes dropping into the water. There was no defense. There was no escape. These VLR Liberators, flying from bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, and Northern Ireland, could now reach the very heart of the mid-Atlantic gap. There was no more Black Pit. There were no more safe havens. Every square mile of the North Atlantic was now under the potential surveillance of Allied aircraft, 24 hours a day. The U-boat commanders, who had once owned the surface of the ocean, were now forced to spend as much time as possible submerged. But their batteries were limited. They had to surface to recharge them, and to use their diesel engines to travel. Every time they came to the surface, they were rolling the dice. Every puff of diesel smoke, every radio transmission, every brief glimpse of a conning tower, could now bring sudden, violent death from the sky. The psychological pressure on the U-boat crews became unbearable. They were being hunted from above, and from the surface, by an enemy who had supernatural eyes and ears. By the spring of 1943, all the pieces of the Allied technological trap were in place. Bletchley Park was on the verge of finally breaking back into the four-rotor shark cipher. The escort ships were equipped with Huff-Duff and centimetric radar, and the skies above the mid-Atlantic gap were now being patrolled by the radar-equipped, Lee Light-carrying VLR Liberators. The stage was set. Admiral Dönitz, still blind to the technological revolution that had just occurred, and emboldened by his successes in the previous months, believed he was on the verge of victory. He was about to order his wolf packs into one final, massive, war-winning assault on the North Atlantic convoys. He thought he was sending his wolves into a sheep pasture. In reality, he was sending them into a perfectly prepared, and perfectly lethal, ambush. The spring of 1943 was the tipping point. Admiral Dönitz, convinced that the Battle of the Atlantic was in its final, decisive phase, gathered the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled. Over 100 submarines were deployed to the North Atlantic convoy routes. His orders were simple: wage a total, all-out assault. Find the convoys, and annihilate them. In March and April, the wolf pack struck with a terrible fury, sinking over 100 ships in a single 20-day period. It seemed as if the U-boats were once again triumphant. But the Allies were ready. The new technologies were now fully deployed across the escort groups and the air squadrons. And in late 1942, Bletchley Park, after a year of agonizing effort, had finally broken back into the shark cipher, giving the Admiralty a priceless, if intermittent, view into Dönitz's plans. The trap was set. And in May of 1943, it was sprung. The month that would forever be known in the annals of the U-boat service as Schwarzer Mai. Black May. The experience of a single convoy battle, the battle for convoy ONS-5, tells the story of the entire month. ONS-5 was a slow, westbound convoy of 43 ships, lumbering through the heart of the mid-Atlantic gap. Dönitz vectored in a massive wolf pack of over 40 U-boats for the kill. It was the largest wolf pack ever assembled. But the convoy's escort was one of the new, elite support groups, led by the veteran British commander Peter Gretton. His ships were equipped with Huff-Duff and the new centimetric radar. And as the wolf pack began to gather, the battle that unfolded was unlike any that had come before. When a U-boat surfaced to transmit a contact report, its position was instantly fixed by Huff-Duff. An escort would immediately peel off and charge towards the bearing, forcing the U-boat to dive and lose contact. The pack was being harried and broken up before it could even get into position. Then, as a ferocious North Atlantic gale descended, the battle became a technological nightmare for the Germans. The U-boat commanders, on the surface, were blind in the storm and the darkness. But the British escorts on their radar screens could see every single U-boat as a clear, distinct blip of light. They were no longer chasing ghosts. They were vectoring in on precise, known targets. The hunters had become the hunted. And then, the aircraft arrived. VLR Liberators from Iceland, equipped with radar and lee lights, appeared over the convoy, right in the middle of the supposedly safe Black Pit. U-boat commanders, surfacing to recharge their batteries, were suddenly illuminated in blinding light, and then bracketed by depth charges. The wolf pack, which had gathered for a slaughter, found itself caught in a perfectly coordinated, three-dimensional ambush. They were being detected by Huff-Duff. They were being seen by radar. And they were being attacked from the sea and from the air. In the brutal, running battle for convoy ONS-5, the Allies lost 12 merchant ships. But the wolf pack lost 7 U-boats sunk, and another 7 were so badly damaged they were forced to withdraw. A proud and massive German force had been fought to a standstill and decisively defeated. And this was just the beginning. All across the Atlantic, the same scene was being repeated. Convoys that were attacked were now fighting back with a new and lethal efficiency. Hunter-killer groups, freed from escort duty and guided by intelligence, were now actively seeking out and destroying the U-boat patrol lines. The U-boat loss rates, which had been sustainable for years, suddenly exploded. In the first 3 weeks of May, 13 U-boats were sunk. In the 4th week alone, another 13 were destroyed. By the end of the month, a total of 41 U-boats had been sent to the bottom of the Atlantic, the vast majority with all hands. The core of the German U-boat service, its most experienced commanders and crews, were being systematically annihilated. The aces of the deep were dying in their steel coffins. The slaughter was so sudden, so total, and so incomprehensible to the German high command that they were in a state of shock. The weapon that was supposed to win the war had been rendered almost useless in a matter of weeks. The hunters, who had once ruled the Atlantic with impunity, were now the ones being sent to a watery grave. Black May was not just a defeat. It was an extermination. The news that reached Admiral Dönitz's headquarters in late May of 1943 was not just bad. It was apocalyptic. Day after day, the reports came in. U-boat after U-boat, many commanded by his most trusted and experienced aces, were failing to report in. They were simply vanishing. The casualty figures were beyond anything he could have imagined. Almost a quarter of his entire frontline operational strength had been destroyed in a single month. The psychological impact on the surviving crews was even worse. Men who had once sailed with a sense of arrogant confidence were now gripped by a cold, numbing fear. They were being hunted by a ghost. An enemy who could see in the dark, hear their whispers, and strike from the sky in a place that was supposed to be safe. The morale of the U-boat arm, once its greatest asset, was collapsing. One returning U-boat commander reported to Dönitz, his voice shaking. "We were blind. They could see us everywhere. The planes came out of the clouds, out of the sun, out of the night. You could dive, but they would be waiting for you when you came up. It is no longer a battle. It is slaughter. We cannot fight what we cannot see." Dönitz, a hard and unsentimental man, was in a state of professional shock. He could not understand what had happened. His tactics had not changed. His men were as brave as ever. His U-boats were the same deadly machines. He suspected a massive breach in his communications, but he could not prove it. He knew of the enemy's radar, but he did not grasp the revolutionary leap of the new centimetric sets. He could not comprehend the perfectly integrated system of detection and destruction that the Allies had so suddenly, and so secretly, unleashed upon him. On May 24, 1943, faced with the undeniable, catastrophic reality of his losses, Admiral Dönitz, the master of the wolf packs, did the unthinkable. He conceded defeat. In his personal war diary, a document of almost unbearable tension and despair, he wrote the words that signaled the end of the happy times forever. "Our losses have reached an intolerable level. The enemy has rendered the U-boat ineffective, not through superior tactics or courage, but through superior science. We are faced with a situation where we are like a man fighting a knight in full armor, but we are armed only with a club. The losses are too great. Therefore, I have been forced to withdraw the boats from the North Atlantic. For now, the battle is lost." He issued the order for the surviving wolf packs to abandon the main convoy routes. He sent them to what he hoped were quieter waters, to the Caribbean, to the coast of Africa. But it was a futile gesture. There were no quiet waters anymore. The Allied technological advantage was now absolute, and it was global. For the men of the WWII, the war had transformed into a suicide mission. The life expectancy of a U-boat crewman plummeted. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat fleet, nearly 30,000 would never return. It was the highest casualty rate of any branch of any military in the entire Second World War. The aces were gone. Gunther Prien, hero of Scapa Flow, had been lost in 1941. Joachim Schepke, killed in the same month. And now, the wave of losses in 1943 had wiped out the next generation of commanders. The once proud brotherhood of heroes had become a conveyor belt of death, sending young, inexperienced crews on hopeless missions from which they would never return. Otto Kretschmer, the greatest ace of them all, was one of the lucky ones. He had been captured in 1941 and spent the rest of the war in a British POW camp. From there, he could only listen to the news of the destruction of the force he had once led. Years later, he would reflect on the defeat with the cold, clear eye of a professional. "The battle was lost not in May of 1943, he said. It was lost on the drawing boards and in the laboratories, 2 years earlier. We were superb hunters, but they had built a better trap. We were fighting a battle. They were fighting a war of science. And in the end, the science was superior." This was the lament of the aces. The final, bitter admission that their courage, their skill, and their sacrifice had been rendered obsolete. They had been defeated not by a better soldier, but by a better system. The withdrawal of the U-boats from the North Atlantic in May of 1943 was the single most strategically decisive, yet least visible, turning point of the war in Europe. There was no grand surrender ceremony. There was no single, famous battle. It was a quiet, technical victory, won in the secret laboratories of scientists, in the quiet huts of codebreakers, and in the noisy factories of industry. But its consequences were monumental. With the U-boat menace defeated, the lifeline to Britain was secure. The trickle of supplies became a flood. An uninterrupted, two-way bridge of ships now spanned the Atlantic. Eastbound, the convoys carried the tools of war. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. Tens of thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. Millions of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food. This was the great build-up. The assembly of the most powerful invasion force the world had ever seen. The force that would, 1 year later, land on the beaches of Normandy. Without the victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, D-Day would have been impossible. The liberation of Europe would have been impossible. Westbound, the convoys carried the currency of knowledge. British scientific innovations, like the cavity magnetron that had created centimetric radar, were sent to America to be mass-produced by the industrial might of the United States. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by a single wonder weapon. It was a victory of systems. It was the perfect integration of intelligence, of science, and of industrial production. The intelligence from Bletchley Park allowed the Allies to know where the enemy was. The science of Huff-Duff and radar allowed the Allies to find the enemy. And the industrial production of thousands of ships and long-range aircraft gave the Allies the tools to kill the enemy. The German U-boat aces, for all their skill and courage, were an elite, almost artisanal force of warriors. They were a handful of brilliant swordsmen. But they had been defeated by an assembly line. An assembly line that produced not just weapons, but a complete, and overwhelmingly superior, system of warfare. The lesson was a brutal one. In the 20th century, the romantic age of the individual warrior was over. Victory in a total, global war was not determined by the quality of your aces, but by the efficiency of your scientists, the ingenuity of your codebreakers, and the sheer, relentless output of your factories. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest, most continuous, and arguably the most important campaign of the entire Second World War. And the men who won it were an unlikely collection of heroes. The civilian merchant seamen who sailed into the jaws of death, trip after trip. The exhausted sailors of the escort groups, who fought a three-dimensional battle in the worst weather on Earth. The brilliant, eccentric minds of Bletchley Park, who fought a silent war of intellect. The scientists and engineers who turned theoretical physics into war-winning hardware. And the pilots of the VLR aircraft, who braved the vast, lonely emptiness of the ocean to close the gap and kill the wolves in their lair. Together, they had faced down Germany's most successful weapon. They had endured the happy times. They had survived the darkness of the Black Pit. And in the end, they had achieved a victory so total, and so decisive, that it had guaranteed the ultimate defeat of the Third Reich. The grey wolves had been tamed. The bridge of ships was secure. And the road to victory was now open.